Well, millions of Americans turn to the FDA for assurances that the medications and products they use are safe. Created in the early 20th century, the agency was designed to protect the U.S. consumer from unsafe, ineffective medications, equipment, and contaminated food. The agency has had some real success stories, from blocking a morning sickness drug in the 60s that caused birth defects to regulating the manufacturing of foods and purity of over-the-counter medications. The FDA has many times ensured that high-quality, trustworthy products enter American homes. But an agency that was once fully taxpayer-funded and thus worked only for the American people has now shifted to being largely funded by the very industries it regulates. 45% of the FDA's overall budget now comes from the companies it's reviewing, and 65% of the FDA's budget specifically for human drug regulation comes directly from Big Pharma itself. Now, how can an agency regulate an industry it's being funded by? That's a pretty basic and fair question. This new way to fund the FDA began in the 90s, and through the years, the FDA's reliance on company money has increased. It all started in the 80s when the HIV crisis was creating fear amongst the masses. People were upset that experimental treatments were taking a while to be approved by the FDA. Typical approval for a drug in that time was in the range of 3 to 8 years. And in response to intense pressure, Congress in the early 90s shifted how the FDA was funded in order to encourage speeding up the process. So instead of the agency being fully taxpayer funded, the new setup would have the drug companies themselves footing part of the bill. Now, this would theoretically allow the FDA to expand and hire more people to speed up the regulatory process. And in exchange for pharma money, the FDA would have to set goal dates for drug reviews that were satisfactory to the drug companies. So let's look at the safety record of the drugs since this change in funding. Now, the FDA doesn't always get it right. Prior to this shift in funding, the FDA withdrew or issued black box warning labels on about 21% of the previously approved drugs. That's not really a great record, but it gets worse after the change in funding. The FDA now withdraws or retroactively slaps warning labels on over 26% of previously approved drugs. This means that over a quarter of all FDA-approved drugs later, sometimes years later, end up either being taken off the market because they find out, oops, they're actually not so safe, or they discover serious side effects that require a large black box warning to be placed on the packaging. And a quarter is being generous. Researchers at the Yale School of Medicine found that nearly a third of approved drugs between 2001 and 2010 ended up having major safety issues years after the medications were made widely available.